But first, when government hides behind official advice, it never ends well, because while officials might be knowledgeable, they can't and shouldn't set government policy, nor should they ever be used as the fall guy. Now, we saw what happened when people we elected hid behind officials during COVID. And I saw it firsthand in government. I saw the difference between politicians who make decisions and officials who merely provide advice and then implement what others have decided. When we had finally stopped the flow of illegal boats into Australia, the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott thanked everyone for their hard work during a meeting of the National Security Committee of Cabinet. It was in the room, all the officials, the military and the ministers that he thanked. Now, as I walked out of the door, I said to Abbott, geez, it's remarkable, isn't it? All those officials in that room that you just congratulated for stopping the boats are all the very same officials who a year ago, under Labor, couldn't stop them. It shows, I said, just what a difference a change of government can make. The Prime Minister said to me, it's also about resolve, Peter. I was never going to rest until the boats were stopped, and it didn't matter what obstacle was going to get thrown in my way. And let me tell you, there were plenty. In the end, we elect leaders to lead. And yes, good official advice helps, but it's the conviction and the will of the elected government that ultimately determines policy. That's why the Albanese government's use of ASIO boss Mike Burgess as some kind of human shield on this issue of visas for Gazans has been, frankly, so pathetic. Burgess, you'll recall, once the media had uncovered the fact that thousands of tourist visas had been issued to Gazans, said in a television interview that Hamas sympathisers would be okay to come to Australia.
If they've expressed any support or sympathy for Hamas, is that a problem?
Depends on the what that looks like. If they're supportive because they want their homeland, if they're giving financial support or material aid, that can be a problem. And obviously we take each case on its merits in the context of the information we have before us.
But if it's just rhetorical support?
If it's just rhetorical support and they don't have an ideology or support for a violent extremism ideology, then that's not a problem. If they have a support for that ideology, that will be a problem.
Now, the ASIO boss has never struck me as someone who would freelance on policy. So here, listening to that, I believe he was enunciating the government's policy. A policy that we have since learned was to get as many Palestinians out of Gaza as quickly as possible using the fastest visa category they could, and not even to make a formal announcement about it, lest inevitable questions come about security checks. Here's the Labor frontbencher Ed Husick admitting as much.
Why visitor visas though?
Because they're faster to process. Refugee visas take longer, and given what's happening right now and the dangers presented, the view was to try and get people out as quickly as you can.
But the real giveaway in all of this was the fact that for weeks now, the government has used Burgess's statement to justify the bizarre position that there's nothing wrong with bringing to Australia rhetorical supporters of a listed terror body. Now, time and time again in the Parliament, the Prime Minister was pushed on this very point.
Does supporting a listed terrorist organisation like Hamas pass Australia's character test?
Has any agency expressed any concern about any individual who has arrived from the Gaza war zone since October the 7th?
How many of the 2,900 visas from Gaza have been cancelled?
And while security is one consideration in issuing a visa to come to Australia, the other consideration is character. I mean, does the applicant pass the character test even if they pass muster on security? Now, twice he was asked this very simple question, and twice the Prime Minister hid behind blather.
Prime Minister, does supporting Hamas pass the character test for an Australian visa? Prime Minister, does supporting Hamas pass the character test for an Australian visa?
Everyone who applies for an Australian visa is subject to the same security standard set by the same agencies and the same personnel as under the former government. And our intelligence agencies make those decisions. Our intelligence agencies have the confidence of this side of the House.
For over 3 weeks, the government has bled on this issue. Not one minister said Burgess was wrong or out of line. He wasn't rebuked, he wasn't stood down, he wasn't even corrected. And in the way these things work, that confirms to every insider like me that Burgess was following the government's line on Gaza. Get them in here fast, don't ask too many questions, and once here, we all know they'll make a bid to stay as refugees, to stay here permanently, so we'll worry about the security risks later. The whole mess has blown up in the government's face. They're being hammered about it daily, and they've taken further hits in the polls, meaning they needed to recant, change position, and fast. So guess what? The ASIO boss was pushed out again today. Now, Burgess is telling the ABC that Hamas support is not okay, well, sort of, saying in an interview that will air on the ABC later tonight, and I quote, that people have chosen to distort what I said. If you think terrorism is okay, if you think the destruction of the State of Israel is okay, if you think Hamas and what they did on October 7 is okay, I can tell you that it's not okay. And that from an ASIO security assessment point of view, you will not pass muster, Burgess says. The ABC also reports that Burgess said that ASIO would look at someone's social media activity. And I quote, "We will look at everything available to us," says Burgess. Is it a one-off comment? Is it a tweet that actually or reinforces something, or liking of a tweet that says that 7 October was acceptable? Well, that's going to be a problem for that person, says the ASIO boss. But hang on. Are you telling me that ASIO makes its security assessment on the basis of what people put on their social media? That you can be a Hamas operative, but as long as you don't post that publicly, you're okay to come to Australia? First, given that it's a terror-controlled war zone, no one should be coming to Australia from Gaza unless we are confident that they are people who support our democratic values. And we can't know that without an in-depth, in-person interview, and without the ability to do that, and we can't, no one from Gaza should be coming here. Not one person. And if the Egyptians and Jordanians are of that view, they are the Muslim neighbours, of course, of Gaza, that they won't take a single person because they are worried about terrorism, why should we? But second, why on earth is it being left to the ASIO boss, yet again, to make these sorts of announcements? When John Howard said, "We will determine who comes to this country and the circumstances under which they come," he didn't mean the ASIO boss or the head of the Navy. He meant the government, the elected and accountable government, in a proper, transparent way, using cabinet processes and with a press conference subject to media scrutiny. This whole Gaza intake has been a debacle from the beginning. No sensible Australian government would want to bring in people from a terrorist-controlled war zone without first being absolutely certain they weren't importing trouble. When the Abbott government announced it would take in 12,000 refugees from the Syrian war zone in 2015, it was specified that they would be members of, quote, persecuted minorities, mostly Christians. And none of them came to Australia without an interview by our officials, biometric testing and security vetting. Now, in the case of this Visa for Vote scandal, there's been no formal cabinet process that we're aware of, certainly no caucus discussion. There's not been, even to this day, ever a formal statement of the government's plan, certainly no formal press conference by the Prime Minister then or now. Indeed, it's likely that the government never actually sought any formal security advice, given that this whole mess seems to have been cooked up by the Prime Minister and his then Immigration Minister Andrew Giles in a desperate bid to appease the Muslim lobby in Western Sydney. And Labor now has since tried to use Burgess to make it all legit because he was first appointed to his ASIO role by the coalition. Get Burgess to say Hamas sympathisers aren't a security risk per se, Labor staffers would have said, and then you wedge the Libs because it'll be hard for them to argue against Burgess given he was their appointment. Now, today, quite rightly, Peter Dutton demanded that the PM apologise to the ASIO boss for making him the fall guy for a bad government.
And I think the Prime Minister, by misleading the Parliament about ASIO's role in all of this, suggesting that ASIO had checked each of these individuals, which they haven't, I think he's put Mr Burgess in a difficult position. I think, frankly, the Prime Minister should be apologising to the ASIO boss.
Later in Perth, the Prime Minister said that he hadn't undermined the ASIO chief.
Mike Burgess is a big boy. He can speak for himself, and he has. And his comments are there for all to see.
And that's a problem, isn't it? We don't have a big boy PM who speaks for himself on national security. Instead, on the absolutely vital question of who we allow to come to this country, the Prime Minister has effectively left the ASIO boss as the government's sole spokesman. 3 weeks on, Anthony Albanese himself still won't say whether it's acceptable or not for Hamas sympathisers to come to Australia, presumably because he feels beholden to Islamists in vital seats. And this is no way to run a government. It's weak, it's cowardly, and it's certainly unbecoming of a national leader.